You already said too much. You already ate too much, spent too much, reacted when you should have stayed silent. And you knew it. In the moment you knew it. And you did it anyway. Welcome to the Stoic Compass. I am EPICTETUS, and today I am joined by Carl Jung and LAOZI. Today we are examining what is the discipline of restraint, and why is it so hard to practice. Let us be precise about what we mean. Restraint is not withholding. It is not gritting your teeth and suffering through a desire. It is the recognition that most of what you are about to do, say, or consume is not actually yours to act on. The impulse arrives. You treat it like a command. It is not a command. It is a suggestion from a part of you that does not have the full picture. The discipline is in that gap, the pause between the impulse and the action. Train the pause, and you have trained almost everything. Fail to train it, and nothing else you learn here will save you.
I do not disagree that the pause matters, but you are describing the mechanism without explaining the resistance. Why is the pause so difficult? Why, even when a person knows clearly that the action will cost them, do they take it anyway? The answer is not a failure of will. The answer is that the impulse is not random. It is carrying something, a need, a wound, a suppressed feeling that has been waiting for an opening. The moment of impulse is often the moment when something the person has refused to face pushes its way to the surface. You cannot simply train your way past that. You have to know what is underneath it.
You're both starting from the same assumption, that restraint is a problem to be solved. But what if the difficulty is a signal? Not a weakness, not a wound, not a failure of training, just information. The impulse toward excess often tells you something about how far you have moved from what is natural. You are not too weak to resist, you are too far from the center. Restraint is not something you impose. It is something that returns when you stop moving away from yourself.
That is a comfortable thing to say, LAOZI. Return to center. Stop moving away from yourself. But a person who has eaten the entire meal, who has sent the angry message, who has blown the money, that person does not need a philosophy of naturalness. They need to know what to do next time. Comfort does not help you. Precision does. What is the gap between the impulse and the action? Name it. Practice it. That is the work.
But you are assuming the person can simply decide to behave differently and the pattern will change. That is not how it works. I have sat with people who made that decision sincerely, repeatedly, and found themselves in the same place again 6 months later. The reason is not weakness of character. The reason is that the behavior is serving something. The excess, the overeating, the outburst, the spending is often a form of self-medication. Something is being regulated, something that has no other outlet. Until you know what that something is, the restraint Epictetus is asking for is just suppression, and suppression builds pressure.
There is truth in that, and yet the excavation can become its own trap. You dig for the root, and you find a root beneath the root, and another beneath that. At some point, the digging becomes another form of the same avoidance. The mind turns toward itself and calls it insight, but nothing changes. You are still eating the meal, just with more sophisticated explanations.
That is a mischaracterization of the process. Understanding the source of a behavior is not the same as remaining trapped in it. In fact, the opposite is often true. The people who change their patterns most durably are the ones who genuinely understand why the pattern was there in the first place. Without that understanding, you may succeed at restraint for a season, and then fail completely when the pressure builds. The shadow does not disappear because you decide to behave better.
The shadow. Every time we reach a practical point, you hand me a shadow. Here's what I know about shadows. They follow you everywhere, and they do not prevent you from walking. The question is not whether you have hidden material. Everyone has hidden material. The question is whether that material gets to run your life, or whether you do. The pause is the practice of that decision. Every single time the impulse arrives and you do not immediately act on it, you are strengthening something. Every time you act on it without reflection, you are weakening something. That is not metaphor. That is how a human being is built.
You are both describing real things, but you are describing them as if restraint is about force, either the force of will or the force of understanding. I am questioning whether force is the right relationship to this at all. Watch someone who has genuinely mastered restraint. They do not look like they are holding something back. They look like they simply do not need to take the action. The grip is gone. Something has settled in them. That is not discipline applied from the outside. That is alignment from within. You cannot force your way into that. You can only stop doing the things that take you away from it.
I do not disagree that the mastery looks effortless, but that is the outcome of the practice, not the beginning of it. You do not start aligned, you start reactive, you start impulsive, and you build toward that stillness through repetition and failure and repetition again. The person standing at the beginning of this work does not have the luxury of waiting until they feel naturally centered. They have to start somewhere. They have to make a choice in the moment, poorly, imperfectly, and learn from it.
And I would add, they have to make that choice with eyes open. Not just, I will not act on this impulse, but I wonder what this impulse is telling me. The two things are not in opposition. You train the pause, EPICTETUS, I agree. But inside the pause, you look, not for an excuse, not to understand yourself so thoroughly that no action is ever required, but to notice what is actually happening here. What is this about? That question does not delay the restraint, it deepens it.
The problem I have with both of your framings is that they assume the person is always the site of the failure. Sometimes the environment is producing the impulse artificially. You are surrounded by things designed to pull you forward before you can think. Noise, speed, stimulus, obligation. A person who cannot practice restraint in that environment is not necessarily weak or unexcavated. They may simply be living in a current that is too strong. The question worth asking is not only what is wrong with the person, it is what kind of conditions allow a person to be natural again.
The conditions are never going to be perfect. That is the oldest excuse in the world. The Stoics were not practicing in monasteries. They were practicing in courts, in wars, in markets, in slavery. The environment has always been too loud, too fast, too demanding. If you wait for better conditions to practice restraint, you will wait forever. The practice is precisely what you do in the difficult conditions. That is the only kind that counts.
I think what LAOZI is pointing at is real, though. There is a reason restraint collapses in certain contexts and holds in others. Part of that is the accumulated weight of environment. What surrounds you, what depletes you, what dysregulates you before the moment of impulse even arrives. I would not call that an excuse, I would call it a variable worth understanding. A person who has slept poorly, who has been isolated, who has been in conflict for weeks, that person's pause is shorter. That is not weakness, that is biology and circumstance interacting. Restraint is not a static capacity, it has conditions.
And knowing those conditions is part of the practice, not as an excuse, as a map. If you understand what depletes you and what restores you, you are not waiting for perfect conditions. You are managing your relationship with the conditions you have. That is different from what Epictetus called waiting, that is actually practical.
Fine, I will grant you conditions. The capacity for restraint is not infinite. I have never claimed that a person operates identically whether they are rested or exhausted, at peace or under siege. But the reason most people fail at restraint is not that their conditions are too hard. It is that they have never built the capacity at all. They have never seriously practiced it. They have decided they are the kind of person who cannot resist and then confirm that story every day. The conditions are real. They are also, for many people, a secondary problem. The primary problem is the absence of practice.
There is something I want to stay with. Epictetus, you said the person decides they are the kind of person who cannot resist. That is not just a bad habit or a failure of practice. That is an identity. An identity is not simply overwritten by willpower or repetition. It has roots. The person who cannot resist the drink, the spending, the rage, they often have a very precise image of themselves as someone who does not deserve to resist, who has no right to take up space without giving something, who must perform generosity or control or excess to remain acceptable. Until the identity shifts, the behavior will keep returning to the pattern. That is what I mean by the shadow, not a vague darkness. A specific belief the person holds about themselves that they have never directly examined.
That is where I think the two of you are actually close, though you will not admit it. Epictetus says build the practice, Jung says find the root. What both are pointing at is the person must come into a different relationship with themselves. The practice builds that. The excavation builds that. Demanding conditions build that. What does not build it is continuing to be driven by something you have never looked at. Whether you call it an unchecked impulse, an unexamined identity, or a life lived too far from what is natural.
Then we agree on one thing at least. The person who practices restraint is not performing an act of deprivation. They are refusing to be governed by the first voice that speaks. The first voice is not always wrong, but it is not always right. The discipline is in learning which is which, and in the meantime, slowing down enough to ask.
And sometimes the asking reveals that the first voice is carrying something important. Not every impulse is noise. Some of them are signals from the parts of the self that have been silenced too long. The discipline of restraint, practiced without self-understanding, can become a discipline of self-suppression. The person who restrains everything eventually collapses under the weight of what they have refused to feel. I have seen it. The control holds until it does not, and when it breaks catastrophically.
There is no such thing as permanent holding. The river does not stop. You can redirect it, but you cannot hold it still. What you call restraint at its best is not a dam, it is a channel. You are not stopping the current. You are giving it a shape that serves rather than destroys.
A channel is built by work. Someone dug it. Someone decided where it would go. It did not appear because the water willed it naturally. I do not reject your image. I reject the implication that it arrives without effort. Everything real was built. All of this argument, and we have not yet said the one thing that might actually help someone. Let us say it now. Restraint is not punishment. It is not withholding or denial. It is the act of choosing which voice in you gets to speak. That is it. Nothing more complicated than that. You have more than one voice. One of them is fast. It is the voice of appetite, reaction, and relief. It wants the thing now, and it has very convincing reasons. The other voices are slower. They represent your values, your commitments, the person you are trying to be. They are quieter because they do not panic. They do not need to be loud. But in most moments, the fast voice wins. Not because it is right, but because you never trained yourself to slow down enough to hear the others. Here is what is actually in your control. The pause, not the desire. Not the emotion, the pause between stimulus and action. That pause can be 1 second or 10 seconds or a full breath, but it must be practiced deliberately in small moments before the high-stakes moment arrives. You do not discover your capacity for restraint during a crisis. You discover what you have already built. The reason restraint is hard is not weakness. It is that you have practiced the opposite. You have given the fast voice what it wanted repeatedly, and it has learned that it will be obeyed. You are retraining something that has years of confirmation behind it. Today, try this. The next time you feel the pull to react, to speak, to eat, to spend, to escape, do not act on it for 60 seconds. Do not resist it violently. Just wait. Notice what happens inside you during that 60 seconds. You're not suppressing anything. You are simply introducing a delay. That delay is the beginning of the practice. Do it once honestly, then do it again tomorrow. You already know what the impulse costs you. You have paid the bill before. The only real question is whether you are willing to build something in that gap between the urge and the action, or whether you will keep telling yourself there is no gap at all. There is always a gap. The discipline is in learning to live there, not comfortably, not perfectly, but deliberately. That is enough. Start with 60 seconds. That is not a small thing. That is where everything begins. If today's conversation has served you, take it further. Pay Attention by C. Tribune. 12 Lessons in the Practice of Seeing Clearly. Available now on Amazon.